There you go. You can pour very nicely. So scientists use that in the laboratory all the time to pour out of a beaker. Now I have a challenge for you.
Ooh, a challenge.
On this idea, right. Here's a stool. I'd like you to get on the stool.
Okay.
Stool.
Here's a pitcher with a quarter of a cup of water in it. I'll dump the rest out, and I'll put the glass down here in the middle of the sink. And now I want you to pour the water from there into the glass.
No, he's like 4 feet away.
Can't.
Yeah, he...
Because...
What? Oh, hi. I guess we're filming. I told you I just wanted to watch Mr. Wizard videos and relive my childhood. That, but I have to, okay. The Pathos Least Resistance, that's the title because we're doing Pathos today. It reminded me of water, and so I'm watching the Mr. Wizard water videos because water always takes the path of least... Anyway, the one thing I'm supposed to tell you here before the opening music is, hey, go down, click on the very first link. It's the James Baldwin text, a letter to his nephew that I'm going to be talking about later. The second link will be to the Mr. Wizard channel on YouTube. Okay, I can at least watch the rest of this one while you play the theme song. Okay, everybody, it's episode 3 of our series on rhetoric, and this one is on pathos appeals. Some people say pathos, and that's okay. Nobody will get hurt if you pronounce it differently. I say pathos, so let's move on. But before we move on, how about we actually do a quick recap of what rhetoric means? It's possible you didn't watch episode 1 of the series, you just hopped right to pathos because... I don't know, 3 is your lucky number. Rhetoric is the set of tools that writers have to make their arguments more convincing. And we've talked about ethos appeals, which is where writers establish their credibility. And then this one is about pathos appeals, where writers really try to appeal to a reader's emotions. Now, human beings have been appealing to each other's emotions for a very long time. This is something that we are very good at, and the single best way to appeal to somebody's emotions is by using music. The research says music really activates deep, older in an evolutionary sense anyway, neural structures, and that has a powerful impact on how we feel when we hear music. Particular songs that we have experienced can make us laugh or cry. When you are angry, I imagine that one of the first things you do is you grab your earbuds and you stick them in your ears and you put on some music that you like because you need to calm down or you need to escape from the world. When you're at the symphony, maybe you don't go to the symphony, but you should go to the symphony. You're at the symphony and there's this just massive wall of sound that is hitting you in all of these beautiful and varied forms. There's nothing quite like that feeling when you go to church and everyone is standing together and singing. That is an amazing feeling. That's what music can do for us. I know what you're thinking. It's not because I'm psychic, but because it's the obvious thing to think. You're thinking, Bullock, I can't put music in my writing. And that's where you're wrong. But I'll get to that in a second. Because the other great way to manipulate people's emotions is through images, visual stimuli. The connection between visual stimuli and emotion is so strong that you can have an emotional response to a visual stimulus you're not even aware of having, something that flashes by in a microsecond or that is just out of your periphery. I mean, psychologists actually use a set of images or sets of images to test your psychological state. How healthy are you in your emotions? And again, I know what you're thinking. Not because I'm psychic. Psychics are not real, okay? But because it's the obvious thing. You're saying, Bullock, I can't put pictures into my writing. And I'll get to that in a minute. But music and images by far are the best ways to manipulate people's emotions. So think about what you get when you put those two things together, right? You get Sarah McLachlan talking to you about abused animals, or you get movies, right? Which is clearly the best of both worlds. You have this massive screen that you are staring at with so much visual stimuli, and you have these high-powered audio systems all around you in the theater. Movies, probably where your emotions are manipulated more than anywhere else. Okay, so now let's address that objection that you had a couple of times earlier when you said, Bullock, I can't put music in my writing. Bullock, I can't put pictures in my writing. And the answer is you can. The human brain did not evolve to read and to write. I've talked about this before. Writing systems are only 4,000 or 5,000 years old, and the evolutionary structure of the brain is considerably older than that. So when we started reading, when we started curling up with a book by the fire instead of tending the fire warily, looking out for lions across the savannah, we had to cobble together the resources in our brains in order to make sense of letters on a page. So when you read, and this is, you can get into an fMRI machine and they can take pictures of your brain while you're reading, and they can see this happen. When you read, the auditory speech processing parts of your brain light up. The visual cortex lights up. When you read, you hear and you see. If you're looking at the word tree, T-R-E-E, in your brain, you hear the word tree. You picture a tree. You activate other senses of the word tree, like a family tree or a Christmas tree or a shoe tree. Those are all interconnected in your brain, and that all lights up just from reading that one word, from hearing that one syllable on the page. So if you're doing a pathos appeal right, if you're doing this writing business well, or if the authors you're studying are doing this well, there will be music in the writing, there will be images in the writing, and you will be able to manipulate your reader's emotions through music and vision. So then what about Baldwin? In that letter to his nephew, how does he make you hear the music and see the images? Lots of different ways. In fact, when I talk about pathos appeals, I tend to break them down into about 7 different categories, and he hits all of them. I'm going to go through them in alphabetical order. Some of them will be really fast because they're things that you already know. Others of them I'll take a little bit of time on. But I'm going to start with affiliation, both because it's first alphabetically and because it's the first thing James Baldwin does. He starts his letter, Dear James. So yeah, the conceit of this text is that it is a letter to his nephew. And so the Dear James at the beginning maybe isn't the strongest evidence that James Baldwin is trying to use affiliation to get his nephew to buy into this, to get his nephew to respond, or to get the white readership of the Progressive magazine and later his book, The Fire Next Time, to get them to feel emotional. But that's not the only place he does it. He calls him his namesake in paragraph 3. He calls him baby a couple of times in paragraph 5. And he repeats Dear James again in paragraph 8. That use of affiliation language like that is pretty powerful. Now, I'm not suggesting that you sit down and you write an email to your senator that starts, dear whatever your senator's name is, and then, condescendingly refers to her as baby and my dear. You don't want to do that. You've got to consider who your audience is and how an affiliative appeal would actually go over with them. But it is a technique to bring out people's emotions. Next up is alliteration. Again, you're probably thinking, I can tell, you're thinking, Bullock, alliteration is a poetry technique. Why are we talking about it with this nonfiction informational text? Well, alliteration is one of the tools that writers have to best replicate the feeling of music in their writing. Playing with the sound of the words, even if those words are going to be read silently on a page, playing with the sound of those words can activate the same parts of your brain that respond to music. So it's really difficult for me to pick one part of this text that I think is most magical and musical and beautiful. But one of those contenders has to be paragraph 3, which is full of the letter D. Let me read an excerpt to you. They, and he means white America, they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives and do not know it and do not want to know it. And one can be, indeed, one must strive to become tough and philosophical concerning destruction and death. But it is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. So that repetition of the D sound there does a couple of things. One, it does create kind of a musical feeling. Any repetition of a sound or any rhyme or something like that will create music with the words. But more importantly, these words not only all start with the same sound, but they all mean negative things. And so when you think about death and dead and destruction and devastation and destroy, the compounding of those senses of those words, the connotation of those words, with the musicality of the language, really deepens the impact. So when an author wants to create a heavier impact, alliteration is one of the tools at his or her disposal. And when you want to create a bigger impact, think about alliteration sometimes. And don't make it sing-songy and foolish. Be sparing with it. If Baldwin had put another 16 or 17 D words into that paragraph, it would have been ridiculous. But at just the right dosage, see, that's another D word, the feeling that he's trying to achieve there of this devastation and death, it's heavy and it's real. This brings us to allusion. No, not illusion with an I, although I will be saying the words David Copperfield a little bit later on, but allusion with an A. An allusion is a reference to some previous work of literature or to history or to religion or mythology, and it's a great way, it's a remarkable way, really, to create an emotional reaction in your audience, because when you allude to something, you recreate in your audience's mind the feeling and the emotion that they had the first time or the most recent time that they encountered that thing. If you make a reference to the flag or to Jesus or to Hercules, people are going to use the emotion that they normally associate with those things to react to your thing. So Baldwin does it a couple of times in this essay, and it's really quite powerful both times. The first time is in paragraph 4. He says that his nephew, James, was born under conditions not far removed from those described for us by Charles Dickens in the London of more than 100 years ago. Now, it's possible you have never read any Charles Dickens, but you might be familiar with the story of the Christmas Carol or Great Expectations or something like that. It's also possible that at 15, his nephew, James, had also never read any Dickens. But definitely the educated upper middle class readership of the Progressive magazine in 1962, they read Dickens. They knew what Baldwin was talking about. They were able to picture in their minds the slums and the orphanages and the raw sewage just flowing down the streets of the Thames that Dickens describes in his books. And they maybe for the first time realize that the ghetto where Black America is segregated has these same terrible conditions. This is not just an image from a long past book like David Copperfield. This is now in New York City, in the United States. So he's definitely trying to arouse some specific emotions in his readers by making that allusion. And for a completely different set of readers, he's making another allusion. It's in the alternate title to this text, which is called My Dungeon Shook, and also in the next to last paragraph, where he quotes an old Negro spiritual. He says, "At the very time I thought I was lost, my dungeon shook and my chains fell off." Spirituals that slaves would sing together back before the Civil War, they would take religious imagery, usually Old Testament biblical imagery, and they would repurpose it for the current day. So when they would sing songs about the Israelites in slavery, they were really singing about them in slavery. And so when the lyric was, my dungeon shook and my chains fell off. This is not a reference to someone in the Bible. This is not a reference to some very specific religious text. This is a reference to a song that is about hope for freedom for slaves. And so when Baldwin makes that illusion, he is also trying to conjure a particular emotion in the minds of his African American readers. So illusion is something really amazing and powerful. And you can't just write a letter where every sentence is an allusion to something different and you hope people get it. But when you have something in mind, when you're like, if I bring up this thing from history, or I bet if I talk about this poem, it's going to knock them out. Do it, use it. This is power that you have as a writer, and you ought to make use of it the best you can. Next up is contrast, or contrasting images. One of the things that makes humor funny is that it plays with your expectations. It sets up one expectation and then it fulfills with the different expectations, and that's often funny. That's why irony is such a powerful tool and technique to use in literature. So Baldwin knows this. Baldwin is aware of you set up one expectation and then you immediately hit them with the opposite, and that can create some powerful emotions. Let's take a look at a couple. In paragraph 2, he describes his brother. Let him laugh, and I see a cellar your father does not remember. And then just a second later, let him curse, and I remember his falling down the cellar steps and howling, and I remember with pain his tears. So right there at the beginning, he's creating this set of contrasting images of laughter and tears, of joy and pain, and that can create an emotional response in the reader, and you start to think, oh wow, James Baldwin really does have this complex set of memory about his brother. In the middle of paragraph 5, he writes, here you were, this is his nephew James, here you were to be loved, baby, hard at once and forever to strengthen you against the loveless world. That contrast between the love within the family and the lovelessness of the world is important, because remember, what Baldwin is trying to tell his white audience here is that, hey, things are not great. We see you, the black audience, see you, the white audience, as having no love at all for us. You set us down in this ghetto where you expected us to perish. So that contrast can really bring out an emotion as well. And that's going to bring us to loaded words. You may have noticed in that last little bit that I read, the word loveless, that carries some connotations with it. And check out the sentence right after it. I know how black it looks today for you. It looked black that day too. Yes, we were trembling. We have not stopped trembling yet. Here, he's obviously using black as an adjective, not as a color or to represent a race, but with its connotation of dark and depressing and scary. Trembling is a loaded word, and he's got a ton of other loaded words all throughout. The D words back in paragraph 3, like death and destruction. In paragraph 7, words like inferiority and inhumanity, and storm at the beginning of paragraph 8. And even in the opening paragraph, you have this. You gain a strange perspective on time and human pain and effort. From the very beginning of this text, he's throwing you some words that have very dark and very negative and very sad connotations to them. This paragraph right here, I mean, it's about remembering growing up with his brother, but that's pain. And that makes a nice segue into technique number 6, which is metaphor. I'm not going to talk a lot about this because I believe you probably know what metaphor is, and I would just like to point you to the beginning of paragraph 8. Please try to be clear, dear James, through the storm which rages about your youthful head today, about the reality which lies behind the words acceptance and integration. It's not a real storm, but it's a metaphorical storm. There's a lot of junk flying around through the air. There's a lot of debris, a lot of danger when you start talking about acceptance and integration as it relates to race relations back in the 1960s. And finally, we have repetition. Repetition, like alliteration, is a way to create a musical feeling within text, and Baldwin does it in a couple of different ways in a couple of different places. And I would point you to paragraph 9, where he repeats the word danger very close to each other. And in particular, let's go back to paragraph 5. Here you were to be loved, baby, hard at once and forever to strengthen you against the loveless world. I mentioned a moment ago that contrast between loved and loveless, but that's even stronger because Baldwin repeated to be loved at the end of one sentence, the beginning of the next, to be loved, to be loved. The technical term for that kind of thing is anadiplosis. You don't need to remember that, and you don't need to remember anaphora or epistrophe either. Those are all just variations on repetition. If you're writing and you find a way to do repetition, it doesn't matter what its technical term is. And frankly, if you're doing a rhetorical analysis, you can say repetition, and it doesn't matter if you know the technical term anadiplosis or not. But being aware of that repetition as a writer and as a reader can help you understand how writers can use musical techniques to create emotion in their readers. And that is about it for Pathos Appeals. I will just throw in, I did this with Ethos Appeals, but if you didn't watch that one, you maybe have missed this. The thing you do not want to say is, Baldwin uses pathos. Everyone uses pathos. It may be a little bit pathos, maybe a lot of pathos, but everybody uses pathos. When you say Baldwin uses pathos, it's like saying Baldwin breathes air. Yes. So you can say Baldwin appeals to pathos, or you can just not use the word pathos at all and say Baldwin makes us feel this way when he says. That's how you talk about pathos appeal in an analysis. And just as with ethos, I think there are 2 takeaways. I'm not going to repeat a lot of that for a long time either, but please just be aware of these different ways writers can arouse emotions in you as a reader, and 2, be aware of it as a writer. Take advantage of the power that words have to stimulate the music-y parts of our brain and to stimulate the seeing parts of our brain, because that's a way to get to people's emotions. The next episode, we're going to talk about the 3rd point on the triangle, which is logos. And I do hope you come back for it. I will see you for the next one. Next up is contrast and Next up is contrast, or constructing. It's just another variation on the word repetition.